What if one Uber ride could expose the conspiracy that killed your brother? Michael Rodriguez was just trying to earn extra money for his son's college tuition on October 23, 2023. But when he picked up Emma Chen outside a Chicago office building, he discovered she had evidence of the same corporate fraud that got his brother, David, murdered 2 years earlier. This is how two strangers chose courage over safety and brought down a criminal empire in a single night. It started at 10:47 p.m. when Michael's phone chimed with a ride request that would change everything.
Michael Rodriguez adjusted his rearview mirror for the third time that evening, a nervous habit he developed over 5 years of driving for Uber. The dashboard clock glowed 10:47 p.m., and the Friday night crowd was just getting started in downtown Chicago. His Honda Civic, with its faded blue paint and 180,000 miles on the odometer, wasn't much to look at, but it was reliable, just like Michael himself. The car smelled faintly of the Pine air freshener hanging from his rearview mirror and the coffee he'd spilled earlier that morning during his day job at Patterson's Auto Parts. Michael worked 2 jobs now, had been doing it for 3 years, ever since his younger brother David died and left him questioning everything about the safe, predictable life he'd built. At 45, Michael had learned that life rarely offered second chances, but tonight felt different somehow. Earlier that day, his 18-year-old son, Carlos, had called with news that still made Michael's chest swell with pride every time he thought about it. He'd been accepted to Northwestern University's engineering program with a full academic scholarship. The call had come while Michael was helping a customer find brake pads for a 2015 Honda Accord, and he'd had to excuse himself to the back room to keep from crying in front of the whole store. Carlos was everything Michael had hoped to be at 18. Focused, brilliant, determined to make something meaningful of his life. The scholarship would cover tuition and most expenses, but there were still books, lab fees, housing deposits, and 100 other costs that his day job at the auto parts store couldn't quite stretch to cover. That's why Michael was here, navigating the neon-lit streets of Chicago instead of home watching the Bulls game with a beer and the satisfaction of a Friday evening well-earned. Every ride tonight was another step toward giving Carlos the future he deserved, a future that didn't involve working nights just to make ends meet, a future where education opened doors instead of debt closing them. Michael had dropped out of community college 26 years ago when Carlos's mother got pregnant and they needed steady income more than long-term plans. It was a sacrifice he'd never regretted, but one he was determined his son would never have to make. The Uber app chimed, breaking his reverie with its distinctive notification sound. A pickup request from the business district, 5-star passenger rating. Destination about 20 minutes out to Evanston. Michael glanced at the surge pricing, 1.5x due to Friday night demand, and felt a small surge of satisfaction. This ride would cover his gas for the weekend and contribute meaningfully to Carlos's college fund. He accepted the ride and pulled away from his spot near Navy Pier, weaving through the late-night traffic with the practiced ease of someone who'd driven these streets for decades. Chicago at night was a different city than the one tourists saw during the day. The bright lights and bustling crowds gave way to a more intimate landscape of night shift workers, late dinners, and people trying to get home safely from wherever Friday night had taken them. Michael knew these streets in ways that GPS could never capture. He knew which alleys to avoid after midnight, which routes would be clogged with bridge traffic, where police like to run speed traps on weekend nights. 5 years of driving strangers around the city had taught him to read not just roads, but people, the subtle signs that indicated whether someone wanted to chat or preferred silence, whether they were celebrating something or running from something. The passenger was waiting outside a gleaming office tower on LaSalle Street, a 30-story monument to corporate success that stayed lit long after business hours. The building housed law firms, consulting companies, and financial services firms, the kind of white-collar businesses that kept Chicago's economy humming but remained largely invisible to people like Michael, who worked with their hands and counted their money in hourly wages rather than annual salaries. She was young, probably late 20s, with shoulder-length dark hair pulled back in a professional style that looked slightly disheveled, as if she'd been running her hands through it repeatedly. Her business attire, a navy blazer over a white blouse, dark slacks, and a sensible low heels, was wrinkled in the way that suggested she'd been wearing it far longer than intended. She carried a large canvas messenger bag over her shoulder and seemed to be looking over her shoulder every few seconds as she approached the car, checking the shadows between buildings and scanning the street for something that made her nervous. "You're Michael?" she asked through the window, her voice carrying a slight tremor that could have been from the cold October air, but felt like something deeper. "That's me. You're—" I glanced at my phone, reading the passenger name from the app. "Emma?" Emma Chen slid into the back seat with practiced efficiency, immediately locking the door behind her, a detail that Michael noticed but didn't comment on. In 5 years of driving, he'd learned to read passengers quickly and respect their boundaries. Some wanted to talk about their day, others preferred the anonymous silence of a hired ride, and a few were running from something. Bad dates, difficult conversations, family drama, professional problems. Emma seemed to fall into that last category, radiating the kind of nervous energy that came from carrying a burden too heavy to shoulder alone. "Thanks for picking me up so quickly," she said, settling into the seat behind him, and placing her bag protectively on her lap, arms crossed over it like she was guarding something precious. "I know it's kind of a long ride to Evanston, especially on a Friday night when you could probably make more money with shorter trips downtown." "No problem at all," Michael replied, pulling into traffic, and noted how Emma kept checking her phone and glancing out the rear window. "Better than the short hops downtown, actually. Gives us both a chance to make the trip worthwhile, and I don't have to deal with drunk college kids every 15 minutes. Emma managed a small smile at that, the first genuine expression he'd seen from her since she got in the car. "Are they really that bad?" Put it this way, I keep a pack of wet wipes and a bottle of Febreze in my glove compartment for a reason." The comment earned him an actual laugh, brief but real, and Michael felt some of the tension in the car ease slightly. He'd learned that nervous passengers often relaxed if he could get them to smile, and a relaxed passenger made for a better ride for everyone involved. The first few miles passed in relative quiet, broken only by the soft hum of NPR on the radio, turned down low enough to be background noise rather than intrusion, and the occasional directions from the GPS. Emma seemed lost in thought, her fingers drumming anxiously against her bag in a rhythm that suggested she was working through some kind of mental calculation or rehearsing a difficult conversation. I caught her in the rearview mirror as we navigated the downtown traffic. She looked exhausted in the bone-deep way that came from more than just a long day, the kind of tiredness that accumulated over weeks or months of carrying stress that couldn't be shared or resolved easily. There were dark circles under her eyes that makeup couldn't quite conceal, and she had a pale complexion of someone who'd been spending too much time under fluorescent lights and not enough time outside. As we merged onto Lakeshore Drive, leaving the dense urban canyon of downtown for the more open stretch along the lakefront, Emma finally spoke up. "Have you been driving for Uber long?" It was a common conversation starter, the kind of small talk that filled the space between strangers sharing a confined space for a predetermined amount of time. Michael had answered the question thousands of times, and his response had become automatic.
Quick pause. Before we continue, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? If you're enjoying these stories, make sure to hit subscribe, because tomorrow's episode is absolutely mind-blowing.
About 5 years now. Started after I got laid off from the manufacturing plant where I was working. Needed something flexible since I was raising my son on my own and wanted to be around for school events and homework help. I must have been tough, Emma said, and there was genuine sympathy in her voice rather than polite conversation filler. Michael shrugged, though she couldn't see the gesture from the back seat. "You do what you have to do. Carlos is 18 now, just got into Northwestern on a full academic scholarship. Kid's going to be an engineer. Mechanical engineering with a focus on sustainable energy systems." He couldn't help the pride that crept into his voice when he talked about Carlos. His son had overcome every obstacle Michael had worried about when he was younger. The challenges of growing up in a single-parent household, the financial constraints that meant choosing between school supplies and name-brand shoes, the social pressures that came with being one of the few Latino kids in advanced placement classes. "That's amazing," Emma said, and for the first time since getting in the car, her voice carried genuine warmth rather than anxious distraction.
You must be incredibly proud. Every single day. He's everything I'm not. Smart enough to see the big picture, disciplined enough to work toward long-term goals, confident enough to believe he can actually change the world. Sometimes I wonder how I managed to raise such a good kid when I was basically figuring it out as I went along. Emma was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer, more thoughtful. Good parents usually don't realize how good they are. The fact that you worried about whether you did right by him probably means you did better than most. Something in her tone made Michael glance in the mirror again. Emma was staring out at Lake Michigan, its dark waters reflecting the city lights like scattered diamonds on black velvet. The October night was clear enough to see the lights of boats anchored far from shore, and the contrast between the urban intensity they'd left behind and the natural expanse of the lake created a sense of space that seemed to invite deeper conversation. There was a sadness in Emma's expression that went deeper than whatever professional crisis had her checking over her shoulder and clutching that bag like it contained her life savings. It was the kind of sadness that came from personal experience with disappointment, with the gap between how the world should work and how it actually did. "What about you?" Michael found himself asking, surprising himself with the personal nature of the question. He usually kept conversations light and professional, partly out of natural reserve and partly because getting too involved in passengers' personal lives was a complication he couldn't afford. Emma let out a laugh that carried more bitterness than humor. "You could say that. I just quit my job. Or got fired. I'm honestly not sure which happened first, and I'm not sure it matters at this point." "That's rough," Michael said, meaning it. He remembered the sick feeling of getting laid off from the plant, the combination of financial panic and wounded pride that came with suddenly being expendable. The economy's been tough the last few years, even for people with good jobs and solid skills. "It's not about the economy," Emma said sharply, then seemed to catch herself, her voice becoming more controlled. "Sorry, I don't mean to dump my problems on you. I'm sure you've got enough passengers who use you as a free therapist. And actually, you'd be surprised how rarely people talk about anything real. Most conversations are about traffic or whether the Cubs have any chance next season. Sometimes it helps to talk to someone who doesn't know the whole story and doesn't have an agenda." Emma considered this, her fingers continuing their nervous drumming against her bag. The sound was barely audible over the road noise and radio, but it created a rhythm that seemed to match her internal struggle between opening up and staying guarded. "What would you do," she asked finally, "if you discovered something at work, something illegal, and when you tried to report it through proper channels, they turned it around and made you the problem instead?" The question hit Michael like a cold wind, bringing with it memories he'd spent 2 years trying to process. His hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel as images of his younger brother David flickered through his mind. David's increasingly agitated phone calls in his final weeks, his growing paranoia about being watched, his insistence that he was going to do the right thing no matter what it cost. "Depends on how illegal we're talking about," Michael said carefully, his voice steady, despite the emotional turmoil the question had triggered. "Money laundering, systematic fraud, tax evasion on a scale that affects hundreds of employees and thousands of shareholders. The kind of thing that ruins people's lives when they lose their pensions or their jobs because the company was bleeding money into offshore accounts while telling everyone the business was healthy." The car fell silent except for the gentle whoosh of passing traffic and the low hum of the heater fighting off the October chill. Michael's hands tightened on the steering wheel as memories of David's last phone call flooded back. His brother's voice shaky and paranoid as he talked about irregularities in the company books, about how he was going to expose the truth regardless of the personal consequences. 3 days after that conversation, David had died in what the Chicago Police Department ruled an accidental fall down the stairs of his Wicker Park apartment building. According to the official report, he'd been drinking at Murphy's Pub down the street, had consumed enough alcohol to impair his judgment, and had somehow missed his footing on the narrow staircase leading to his second-floor apartment. Case closed, no further investigation warranted. But David had been a careful man, someone who rarely drank more than a beer with dinner on weekends. More importantly, he'd been genuinely frightened in those final weeks, convinced that someone was following him, that his phone was being monitored, that his supervisors at work were looking for reasons to discredit him before he could report what he'd discovered. "That's the kind of thing that can get people hurt," Michael said quietly, the words carrying more weight than Emma could possibly understand. "I know," she whispered, and there was real fear in her voice now. "God, I know." The admission hung between them like a shared secret, creating an intimacy that neither of them had expected when the ride began. Michael found himself genuinely concerned for the stranger in his back seat, this young woman who'd stumbled into the same kind of dangerous knowledge that had cost his brother his life. As they continued north along the lakefront, the city lights giving way to the quieter residential areas approaching Evanston, Michael made a decision that would change both of their lives forever.
As they continued north along the lakefront, Michael found himself studying Emma more closely in the rearview mirror. There was something familiar about her story, something that resonated with a pain he'd been carrying for 2 years. But he'd learned to be careful about getting involved in other people's problems. He had Carlos to think about, a steady income to protect, a quiet life that didn't need complications. Yet something about Emma's situation wouldn't let him dismiss it as easily as he usually would. Maybe it was the genuine fear in her voice, or the way she held that bag like it contained evidence of something terrible. Or maybe it was the memory of David's voice during their last conversation, saying almost exactly what Emma had just said, that he'd tried to do the right thing through proper channels and had been made the villain instead. 23 minutes into what should have been a routine ride to Evanston, Emma's phone buzzed with a text message that changed everything. Michael watched in the rearview mirror as her face went pale, her hands beginning to shake as she read whatever was on the screen. The nervous energy that had been simmering beneath the surface since she got in the car suddenly spiked into something approaching panic. "Actually," she said, her voice tight with barely controlled fear, "could we make a stop first? There's a diner up ahead, Pete's 24-hour. I know it adds to the fare, and I know you probably want to finish this ride and move on to the next one, but I'll cover the extra time and distance." Michael knew Pete's Diner well. It was a Chicago institution, one of those places that had been serving the city's night shift workers, insomniacs, and lost souls for 3 decades. The original Pete had passed away 5 years earlier, leaving the business to his daughter Maria, who'd maintained the same commitment to strong coffee, honest food, and non-judgmental service that had made the place a refuge for people who needed somewhere to go when the rest of the world was closed. The diner occupied a corner lot in a neighborhood that had seen better decades, its red neon sign flickering intermittently over a parking lot filled with cars of cab drivers taking meal breaks, hospital workers getting off late shifts, and the occasional insomniac seeking comfort food and human connection. Michael had stopped there himself during long nights, drawn by the reliable coffee and the fact that Maria never made single customers feel awkward about occupying a booth meant for 4 people. "Everything okay?" he asked, though it clearly wasn't. Emma was now checking her phone compulsively, her breathing becoming shallow and rapid in a way that suggested she was fighting off a panic attack. I need a minute to think, and I'm starving. I haven't eaten anything since breakfast this morning, and my blood sugar is probably somewhere around 0. Emma's voice wavered slightly, and Michael could hear her trying to convince herself as much as him. "Would you mind joining me? I mean, I know you're working and time is money, but I'll cover the extra time and distance, and honestly, I could really use the company right now." Every instinct Michael had developed over 5 years of careful boundary management told him to politely decline, drop her at the diner, wish her luck with whatever crisis she was facing, and continue with his night. He had car payments to make, Carlos's college expenses to worry about, and a mortgage that wouldn't pay itself. Getting involved in a passenger's personal drama was exactly the kind of complication that could spiral into problems he couldn't afford. But as he looked at Emma in the mirror, really looked at her, he saw something that reminded him powerfully of David in those final weeks. The same haunted expression, the same weight of carrying dangerous knowledge alone, the same desperate need for someone to believe them and take them seriously. More than that, he saw genuine fear, the kind that came from knowing that powerful people wanted to silence you and having nowhere safe to turn. Sure, he heard himself saying, making a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. I could use some coffee anyway, and Maria makes the best apple pie in Chicago. 20 minutes later, they were walking into Pete's diner, and Michael was struck by how much the familiar environment seemed to calm Emma's nerves. The warm lighting, the smell of bacon grease and fresh coffee, the comforting sounds of quiet conversation and clinking silverware created an atmosphere that felt safe and normal in a way that the corporate office tower and even Michael's car had not. The diner was maybe a quarter full, populated by the kind of people that made up Chicago's late-night landscape. A couple of nurses, still in scrubs, sharing a piece of chocolate cake at the counter, their conversation a mix of exhausted laughter and work complaints. A taxi driver in his 60s reading a Spanish-language newspaper over eggs and hash browns, occasionally making notes in a small notebook. An elderly man with kind eyes and careful hands nursing coffee and working methodically through a crossword puzzle. A young couple holding hands across a table covered with the remnants of a late dinner, talking in the intense whispers of people working through relationship problems. Emma chose a corner booth with a clear view of both the parking lot and the kitchen entrance, another detail Michael filed away as potentially significant. They were seated beneath a vintage Chicago Bears poster and across from a jukebox that probably hadn't played a song recorded after 1985, creating an environment that felt removed from the modern world where corporate corruption and digital surveillance were possible. Maria, a woman in her early 50s with graying hair and the kind of warm smile that made strangers feel welcome, approached their table with a coffee pot in hand and an intuitive understanding of what they needed. "Coffee to start?" she asked, already filling their cups without waiting for an answer. "And you both look like you could use some real food. The meatloaf is fresh, the chili will warm you up from the inside out, and I made apple pie this afternoon that'll remind you why life is worth living." Emma managed a genuine smile for the first time since getting in Michael's car. "The pie sounds perfect, and maybe some toast? I don't think my stomach can handle anything too heavy right now." "Coming right up, honey. What about you, Michael?" Michael was surprised that Maria remembered his name. He'd only been in a few times over the years, but grateful for the personal touch. "Just the pie for me, thanks, and maybe a refill on this coffee when you get a chance." After Maria left them alone, Emma wrapped her hands around her coffee mug as if trying to absorb its warmth. The simple act of being in a safe, well-lit public place with another person seemed to have steadied her nerves enough to conversation, but Michael could still see the tension in her shoulders and the way her eyes occasionally darted towards the windows. "So," Michael said gently, "you want to tell me what really happened today?" Emma took a long sip of coffee, buying herself time to decide how much to reveal. When she finally spoke, her voice was steadier than it was in the car, as if the diner's atmosphere had given her some of her professional composure back. "I have been working as a senior financial analyst for Meridian Industries for 3 years. It's a good company, or I thought it was. Mid-sized manufacturing firm, about 1,500 employees, mostly government contracts with some private sector work, good benefits, clear promotion track, the kind of place where you could build a career." She paused as Maria returned with their food, waiting until they were alone again before continuing. "My specialty was regulatory compliance, making sure all our financial reporting met federal standards, that our tax filings were accurate, that our books would pass any audit. It's detail-oriented work, but I'm good at it, and I genuinely believed I was helping the company stay on the right side of the law." "And they weren't?" "Not even close." I pulled her canvas bag closer, unconsciously protective of whatever evidence she was carrying. "About 6 months ago, I started noticing discrepancies in the quarterly reports. Nothing huge at first, just numbers that didn't quite add up when you compared internal documents to what we were filing with the SEC. Transfer amounts that seemed unusual, expense categories that didn't match up with actual business operations." She took another sip of coffee, organizing her thoughts with the precision of someone trained to present complex financial information clearly.
But the more I dug into it, the more I found they've been systematically moving money through a network of shell companies for at least 5 years, maybe longer, hiding profits in offshore accounts, inflating expenses to reduce taxable income, creating fake losses to justify layoffs while the executives paid themselves bonuses. Michael set down his fork, his appetite disappearing as memories of David's similar discoveries flooded back. How much money are we talking about? Tens of millions of dollars, Michael. Money that should have gone to employee retirement funds, to facilities improvements, to honest reporting to shareholders and tax authorities. Instead, it was being siphoned off to make a handful of executives wealthy while they convinced everyone else that the company was struggling. Emma's voice was gaining strength as she talked, the professional part of her taking over from the frightened part. This was clearly something she'd rehearsed, evidence she'd organized and documented with the thoroughness of someone who understood the importance of getting the details right. "What did you do when you discovered all this?" Michael asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "I followed protocol. I went to my direct supervisor first, a man named David Hartman, who'd been my mentor since I started at the company. He brushed me off, said I was misunderstanding the complexity of corporate finance, that there were aspects of the business I wasn't privy to that would explain the discrepancies." Emma's expression darkened with the memory of that conversation. "So I went higher up the chain, department head, compliance officer, eventually even sent a carefully worded memo to the CEO's office expressing concerns about potential regulatory violations and requesting clarification on several financial transactions. Let me guess they didn't thank you for your diligence." Emma's laugh was bitter, carrying none of the warmth that had briefly appeared when she'd smiled at Maria. "2 weeks ago, my access to the financial databases was suddenly temporarily restricted pending a system upgrade. Last week, I was called into HR and told that due to restructuring and budget constraints, my position was being eliminated effective immediately." She paused to take a shaky breath before continuing. "Today, I was escorted out of the building by security, 2 guards who treated me like I was a criminal and told that any attempt to contact former colleagues or remove company property would result in immediate legal action. They also suggested that I might want to consider relocating for personal safety reasons, which I interpreted as a not-so-subtle threat." Michael felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather outside. The pattern was identical to what David had described in his final weeks: the systematic discrediting, the isolation, the escalating pressure designed to silence potential whistleblowers. "But you have evidence," he said, nodding toward her bag. "I have copies of everything," Emma confirmed, her hand moving protectively to the canvas messenger bag that she'd been guarding since getting in his car. "Bank records, internal memos, email chains that showed the executives knew exactly what they were doing and when. I started documenting everything I could 6 months ago when the discrepancies first caught my attention, and I made sure to create backups before they cut off my database access." Michael set down his coffee cup with hands that were starting to shake slightly. "Emma, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. What's the name of the company you worked for?" "Meridian Industries. They're headquartered in the Loop, but they have manufacturing facilities in Indiana and Wisconsin. Mostly defense contracts, some automotive parts." "Why do you ask?" The name hit me like a physical blow, confirmation of a connection I'd been dreading since Emma first started describing her situation. I heard that name before, 2 years ago, in David's increasingly agitated phone calls during his final weeks. His brother worked for a smaller company that Michael now realized with crystal clarity had been either acquired by or partnered with Meridian Industries. "My brother worked for a company that had business relationships with Meridian," he said slowly, his voice carefully controlled despite the emotional storm building inside him. "David Rodriguez. He was a senior accountant for Rodriguez Manufacturing Solutions, a family business that our grandfather started in the 1970s. Emma's eyes widened with recognition. "RMS is listed in our subsidiary files. They handle some of our smaller government contracts, particularly in the automotive sector." 2 years ago, David started talking about financial irregularities he discovered at his company. He said money was being moved through accounts that didn't make sense, that expenses were being inflated and profits hidden. He told me he was going to report what he'd found to the appropriate authorities, that it was the right thing to do regardless of the personal consequences. Michael's voice remained steady, but his hands were trembling now as he reached for his coffee. What happened to him? Emma asked, though her expression suggested she already knew the answer. He died. Officially, it was ruled an accidental fall down the stairs of his apartment building after what witnesses described as a night of drinking at a local bar. The police investigation concluded that he'd consumed enough alcohol to impair his judgment and had simply lost his footing on the narrow staircase leading to a second-floor apartment. Michael paused, forcing himself to continue, despite the pain that talking about David's death always brought. But David barely drank, Emma. Maybe a beer with dinner on weekends, maybe a glass of wine on holidays. And he'd been genuinely paranoid in the weeks before he died. He said he felt like he was being watched, that his phone calls were being monitored, that people at work were looking for ways to discredit him before he could report the fraud he'd discovered. The diner suddenly felt too quiet around them, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. Emma stared at Michael across the table, her professional composure finally cracking completely to reveal raw terror underneath. Oh my God, they killed him. I don't know that for certain, Michael said quickly, though the certainty in his chest suggested otherwise. The police investigation was thorough, and there was no physical evidence of foul play. But the timing... What was the date? Emma asked, urgently, already pulling her tablet from her bag and scrolling through files with fingers that shook with adrenaline and fear. October 15th, 2021. Why? Emma's face went white as she found what she was looking for. Because that's 3 days after RMS received a major contract extension from Meridian and 1 week before a scheduled audit of their books that was mysteriously canceled due to scheduling conflicts. She turned the tablet toward Michael, showing him a spreadsheet that documented financial transactions between Meridian and its subsidiary companies. Your brother's company was being used as a conduit from money laundering, Michael. Small amounts individually, but millions when you add them all up over time. Michael stared at the screen, seeing his family's business, the company his grandfather had built from nothing that had employed 3 generations of Rodriguez men, listed among a dozen other small firms that existed primarily to help Meridian Industries hide money from federal tax authorities.
Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
"They're going to come after me next," Emma said, her voice hollow with the realization of her situation. "Just like they went after your brother." Before Michael could respond, the diner's front door chimed with the distinctive sound of the brass bell that Maria had installed to announce new customers. Both of them looked up reflexively, and Michael felt his blood turn to ice water. A man in a dark coat was standing just inside the entrance, scanning the restaurant with the measured gaze of someone accustomed to finding what he was looking for. He was tall, probably in his 50s, with graying hair and the kind of observant eyes that miss nothing. There was something about his posture and movement that suggested authority, police, military, or corporate security. Emma's face went completely white. "We need to go," she said, starting to slide out of the booth with movements made clumsy by panic. "We need to go right now." But it was too late. The man had spotted them, and he was walking directly toward their table with the unhurried confidence of someone who knew his targets had nowhere to run. Michael's mind raced through possibilities: back exit through the kitchen, side door near the restrooms, even the windows, if necessary. But all of those options would require getting past the approaching stranger first. "Sit tight," Michael said, quietly, surprising himself with the steadiness of his voice. "Let's see what he wants before we assume the worst." The man reached their table and stopped, his presence somehow filling the space despite the fact that he wasn't particularly large or intimidating. Up close, Michael could see that he was older than he had first appeared, with the kind of weathered face that came from years of working outside or dealing with difficult situations. His coat was expensive, but not flashy. His shoes were practical rather than fashionable, and his overall appearance suggested someone who was professional but not corporate. "Emma Chen?" he asked, his voice carrying the kind of authority that expected honest answers, but didn't sound immediately threatening. Emma's flight instinct was clearly warring with the paralyzing realization that running might only make things worse. "Yes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The man reached into his coat, and Michael tensed, preparing to throw himself between Emma and whatever weapon might be emerging. Instead, the man produced a leather wallet containing a badge and identification card. "I'm Detective James Wilson, Chicago Police Department," he said, his tone remaining professionally neutral. "I need to speak with you about some concerns your former employer has raised regarding your departure from their company." As Detective Wilson settled into the booth beside Michael, the nature of their situation became clear. This wasn't a corporate hitman or private security contractor sent to silence a whistleblower. This was a Chicago police detective, which meant Emma's former employer had involved law enforcement in their efforts to discredit her. The question was whether Wilson was genuinely investigating a legitimate complaint or whether he was part of the cover-up that likely cost David his life.
Detective James Wilson studied both of them with the kind of measured assessment that came from 28 years of asking questions and evaluating answers. His presence transformed the cozy diner booth into an interrogation room, even though his manner remained conversational rather than confrontational. "They filed a report this afternoon," Wilson continued, settling into the booth across from them with the careful movements of someone whose back had been bothering him for the better part of a decade. "Meridian Industries claims that you left their premises with confidential company documents and that they're concerned about your mental state and potential whereabouts." Emma's shoulders sagged slightly, a mixture of relief and apprehension crossing her face. "They said I was missing?" According to their head of security, a man named Marcus Webb, who has an interesting background in military contracting and corporate problem-solving, you made verbal threats against company executives during your termination meeting, stole proprietary financial documents, and disappeared without providing a forwarding address. Wilson's tone remained neutral, but Michael caught something in his expression that suggested skepticism about the official story. The detective's eyes were intelligent and experienced, the kind that had heard enough corporate speak over the years to recognize it when they encountered it. "May I sit down for a few minutes?" Wilson asked, though he was already sliding into the booth next to Michael. "I'd like to hear your version of events before I file my report." Up close, Wilson looked exactly like what Central Casting would order for a veteran Chicago detective. His graying hair was cut short and practical. His face showed the wear patterns of someone who'd spent decades dealing with the city's problems, and his eyes carried the particular kind of tiredness that came from seeing too much of humanity's capacity for both cruelty and kindness. His coat was off the rack but well-maintained, his shoes were practical rather than stylish, and his overall appearance suggested someone who took his job seriously without taking himself too seriously. "I'm not missing," Emma said, finding her voice and some of her professional composure. "I was terminated from my position today and escorted from the building by security guards who treated me like a criminal. I have every right to be wherever I choose to be." "Absolutely," Wilson agreed, signaling Maria for coffee with the practiced gesture of someone who'd conducted hundreds of interviews in restaurants and diners over the years. "Though Meridian's legal department seems to think you might have taken some files that belonged to them." Emma's hand moved protectively to her canvas bag, a gesture that Wilson noted without comment. "Any documents I have in my possession were created as part of my job responsibilities over 3 years of employment, and they document potential legal violations by the company that I believe should be investigated by appropriate authorities." Wilson nodded slowly, his expression giving nothing away as he processed this information. "And you are?" he asked, turning his attention to Michael with the kind of direct gaze that probably convinced thousands of suspects and witnesses to tell the truth over the years. "Michael Rodriguez. I'm her Uber driver. Just happened to be having coffee together at midnight?" Michael felt the weight of the moment, the choice between easy lies that would extricate him from a complicated situation and difficult truths that would pull him deeper into something potentially dangerous. The memory of David's voice during their last phone call, determined and frightened, but absolutely certain he was doing the right thing, made the decision for him. Emma needed to stop and think through some serious problems. I agreed to wait and keep her company. "What kind of problems?" It was Emma who answered, her voice gaining strength as she made her own choice about how much truth to reveal. "The kind of problems that apparently got Michael's brother killed 2 years ago for trying to report the same type of financial fraud I discovered at Meridian Industries." Wilson's expression sharpened immediately, his professional detachment replaced by genuine interest and something that looked like recognition. He pulled out a small leather notebook and a pen that had seen better days, flipping to a fresh page with practiced efficiency. "I'm going to need you to be much more specific about that," he said, his tone shifting from routine inquiry to active investigation. Michael took a deep breath, feeling like he was stepping off a cliff into unknown territory. The memory of David's voice during their last phone call, determined and frightened but absolutely certain he was doing the right thing, made the decision for him. "My brother David worked for Rodriguez Manufacturing Solutions, which did contract work for Meridian Industries. 2 years ago, he started discovering financial irregularities, money being moved through accounts that didn't make business sense, expenses that were inflated, profits that were being hidden from tax authorities." Wilson's pen moved steadily across the notebook page as he took detailed notes. "David Rodriguez, October 2021. Michael's surprise must have shown on his face because Wilson's expression became almost sympathetic. "You know about it?" "I know about a lot of things, Michael, including the fact that RMS was one of several small companies that had unusual financial relationships with Meridian Industries over the past 5 years. And I know that accidental deaths among potential whistleblowers have an unfortunate tendency to cluster around certain corporations." Emma leaned forward, her earlier fear being replaced by something that looked like hope. "You've been investigating Meridian?" Wilson accepted a coffee cup from Maria with a grateful nod, settling in with the air of someone prepared for a long and detailed conversation. "Let's say I've been keeping a careful eye on them for quite some time. Your former employer has had several employees and business partners die or disappear under unusual circumstances over the past few years. Nothing that would hold up in court individually, but taken together, the pattern is statistically improbable." He took a sip of coffee and continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone sharing information rather than conducting an interrogation. "Here's what I know about tonight specifically. At approximately 6 p.m., Meridian's head of security, the aforementioned Marcus Webb, called in a missing person report on Emma Chen. He claimed that during your termination meeting, you made verbal threats against company executives, expressed suicidal ideation, and stole proprietary information before disappearing without providing a forwarding address. He suggested that you might be mentally unstable and potentially dangerous to yourself or others."
"That's complete bullshit," Emma said with more heat than she'd shown all evening. "I'm sure it is. I'm also sure that Marcus Webb is a former military contractor with documented connections to some very unpleasant people, and that companies like Meridian don't usually go to such elaborate lengths to discredit former employees unless they're genuinely worried about what those employees might reveal." Wilson flipped a page in his notebook and continued. "What's particularly interesting is that this isn't the first time Webb has filed suspicious missing person reports. In the past 3 years, he's reported 4 different people missing under circumstances that later proved to be either exaggerated or completely fabricated." The implications of this revelation settled over their corner of the diner like a heavy blanket. Michael felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place, pieces he hadn't even known existed until this moment. "You think they're using missing person reports to create a paper trail that makes subsequent accidents look more plausible?" "It's an effective strategy," Wilson acknowledged. "Someone goes missing, there's an official police report documenting their allegedly unstable mental state, and when their body turns up a few days later, it looks like a tragic but predictable outcome rather than something that requires serious investigation." Emma had gone very pale again, the hope that had briefly flickered in her eyes being replaced by stark terror. "So what you're telling us is that I'm already dead, officially speaking. They've created the narrative, filed the paperwork, and now it's just a matter of time before they arrange the tragic accident that proved them right." "Not necessarily," Wilson said, and there was something in his tone that suggested he had more cards to play. "The difference is that this time, they're dealing with someone who's been watching them, someone who's been documenting their patterns, and someone who's been waiting for the right opportunity to build a case that might actually stick." Michael studied the detective's face, looking for signs of deception or hidden agenda. What he saw was exhaustion, determination, and something that looked like personal investment in the outcome. "What do you need from us?" Michael asked. He studied him carefully, his experienced eyes taking in details that most people would miss. "That's an interesting question, Michael. Most people in your position would be looking for the nearest exit right about now, trying to distance themselves from a situation that could get very complicated very quickly. Most people didn't lose their brother to whatever this is." "Fair enough." He turned his attention back to Emma. "What I need from you is simple in concept, but difficult in execution. I need you to know if you're willing to officially report what you've discovered, knowing that it will put you at significant personal risk, but might be the key to bringing down a criminal organization that's been operating with impunity for years." Emma's hands were shaking as she reached for her coffee, the cup rattling slightly against the saucer. "If I say yes, what kind of protection can you offer?" Wilson's answer was brutally honest. "Limited. I can put you in touch with federal agencies that specialize in corporate fraud and have resources I don't have access to. I can make sure your testimony gets to the right people at the FBI and the Securities and Exchange Commission. I can do my best to keep you safe during the investigation and trial process, but I won't lie to you, people who cross Meridian Industries have a documented tendency to have fatal accidents." "Like David," Michael said quietly. "Like David, and like at least 3 other potential witnesses I've identified over the past 2 years who died under circumstances that were ruled accidental, but were statistically improbable." The weight of this revelation hung heavy in the air between them. Emma closed her eyes, and Michael could practically see her weighing her options. Stay quiet and hope Meridian leaves her alone, or speak up and risk everything for the uncertain chance at justice. "There's something else you both need to understand," Wilson continued, his voice becoming more urgent. "According to my sources inside the company, Meridian is planning to destroy evidence in the very near future. They're going to have a convenient computer system failure sometime in the next few days that will wipe out years of financial records, claiming it's the result of a cyber attack or technical malfunction." Emma's eyes snapped open. "They can't do that. Federal regulations require them to maintain financial records for 7 years. "They can if the destruction appears to be accidental, and they can demonstrate that they made good faith efforts to prevent it. After that kind of data loss, even if someone wanted to investigate the fraud you've documented, there wouldn't be enough evidence left to build a prosecutable case." "So it's now or never." Emma understood the implications immediately. "Essentially, yes. If you're going to act on what you know, it has to be within the next 48 hours, or it becomes meaningless." Michael found himself speaking before he'd fully processed what he was about to say. What if she wasn't the only witness? What if there was someone else who could corroborate her story with independent evidence? Wilson raised an eyebrow, his professional interest clearly piqued. "What are you suggesting?" David kept records. He was paranoid toward the end, but he was also methodical and thorough. He had a safe deposit box at First National Bank that I inherited but never opened. Figured it was just personal documents, maybe some family photos or legal papers I wasn't emotionally ready to deal with. Emma stared at him across the table, hope and disbelief warring at her expression. "You think he documented what he found?" "I think David knew he was taking a massive risk by planning to report the fraud. He would have wanted some kind of insurance policy, some way to make sure the truth came out even if something happened to him. He was always careful about documentation, kept receipts for everything, maintained detailed records of all his business transactions." Wilson leaned back in the booth, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth for the first time since he'd sat down. "Now we're getting somewhere interesting. Emma, if you're willing to testify about what you discovered and provide the evidence you've collected, and Michael can provide corroborating documentation from his brother's independent investigation, we might actually have enough to build a case that could survive Meridian's legal challenges." "And if we say no?" Emma asked. "Then Meridian Industries continues to steal millions of dollars from taxpayers and shareholders, continues to threaten and eliminate anyone who gets too close to the truth, and continues to operate with complete impunity. The pattern continues, more people die, and justice gets deferred indefinitely." The diner around them seemed to fade into background noise as the 3 of them sat in contemplative silence, each weighing the magnitude of the decision before them. Michael thought about Carlos,
about the safe, predictable life he'd carefully constructed for both of them over the past 2 years. Then he thought about David, about the phone call where his brother had said he was going to do the right thing no matter what it cost. He thought about Emma, this stranger who'd gotten into his car a few hours ago and had somehow become the key to finally understanding his brother's death and possibly preventing others like it. He thought about all the other potential victims out there, employees whose pensions were being stolen, shareholders being defrauded, whistleblowers who might be marked for death because they'd stumbled onto the same truth that cost David his life. Emma was the first to speak, her voice quiet but steady. If I do this, if I testify and provide all the evidence I've collected, what happens to me afterwards? Assuming I survive the process, what kind of life am I looking at? Wilson's expression was sympathetic but realistic. Witness protection is a possibility, though it's not guaranteed and it's not pleasant. More likely, you'd need to relocate, change your name, start over somewhere else with a completely new identity. It's not an easy life, but it's a life. And if I don't? Wilson's expression became grim, his professional mask slipping to reveal genuine concern. Honestly, based on the pattern I've documented, I'd give you maybe 6 months before you have a fatal accident. Meridian doesn't leave loose ends, and they have the resources and connections to make problems disappear permanently. Michael felt the weight of David's memory, the 2 years of unanswered questions and suppressed grief that had been his constant companion since his brother's death. "I'm in," he said, surprising himself with the firmness of his decision. "Whatever you need from David's records, whatever testimony you need about his death and what led up to it, I'm in." Emma looked at him across the table, this stranger who had become her unexpected ally and possibly her salvation in the span of a few hours. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why would you risk everything for someone you just met?" Michael thought about this for a moment, surprised to find that the answer came without hesitation or doubt. "Because 2 years ago, my brother died trying to do the right thing, and nobody cared enough to ask the hard questions that might have led to the truth. Because if I don't help you now, I'll spend the rest of my life knowing that I had the chance to prevent whatever happens next and chose safety over justice." He paused, then added with conviction that surprised him. "And because sometimes the most important thing you can do is stand up for a stranger when they need it most, especially when no one else will." Emma nodded slowly, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes as she made her own decision. "Okay," she said to Wilson, her voice gaining strength with each word. "Let's do it. Let's bring these bastards down." As Detective Wilson pulled out his phone to make the first of what would be many calls to federal agencies, Michael realized that his quiet life as part-time Uber driver and full-time worrier about his son's future was about to become something he'd never imagined. But for the first time since David's death, he felt like he was moving towards something meaningful rather than just away from pain. And for the first time in 2 years, he had hope that his brother's death might finally lead to something more than just unanswered questions and buried grief.
The next several hours passed in a blur of phone calls, urgent meetings, and careful coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies. By 3 a.m., they were sitting in a federal building in downtown Chicago, surrounded by FBI agents, Securities and Exchange Commission investigators, and federal prosecutors who had been pulled from their beds to evaluate what Wilson described as a potential breakthrough in a multi-year investigation into corporate fraud and conspiracy. The conference room smelled of stale coffee and the nervous energy of people working on too little sleep and too much adrenaline. Emma sat at a polished table, walking a team of federal agents through her evidence with the methodical precision of someone who had spent months preparing for exactly this moment. Her tablet and printed documents were spread across the table like pieces of an enormously complex puzzle. Each transaction and communication, another thread in a web of corruption that had taken years to construct and might take even longer to unravel. Michael provided what details he could remember about David's final weeks. The phone calls that had grown increasingly agitated, the paranoia that had seemed unreasonable at the time but now felt like justified caution. The specific concerns his brother had mentioned about money being moved through accounts that didn't correspond to legitimate business operations. Your brother was building a case, Agent Sarah Martinez explained to Michael as they took a break from the formal interview process. She was a woman in her early 40s with sharp intelligence in her eyes and the kind of focused energy that came from years of pursuing complex white-collar criminals. These notes and documents you found in his safe deposit box, he wasn't just documenting fraud for the sake of reporting it. He was creating a comprehensive record that would be prosecutable in federal court. The safe deposit box had indeed proved the breakthrough Wilson had hoped for. David had been methodical in his documentation, creating copies of financial records that showed money laundering on a massive scale. Email printouts that demonstrated executive knowledge of illegal activities, and even audio recordings, made surreptitiously during meetings, of conversations in which supervisors acknowledged the fraud and discussed ways to continue concealing it. More importantly, David had connected the dots between Rodriguez Manufacturing Solutions and Meridian Industries in ways that Emma's evidence alone couldn't have proven. His documentation showed that RMS was just one node in a network of more than 20 small companies that existed primarily to help Meridian hide profits, inflate expenses, and avoid federal taxation. The sophistication of this operation is remarkable, Agent Martinez continued, reviewing David's meticulously organized files. Your brother identified patterns and connections that would have taken our forensic accountants months to discover, and he did it while maintaining his regular job responsibilities and trying to stay under the radar of people who were clearly willing to kill to protect their secret. The federal investigation moved with a speed and efficiency that surprised everyone involved. Within a week of that midnight meeting at Pete's Diner, search warrants were being executed simultaneously at Meridian's corporate headquarters, their manufacturing facilities in Indiana and Wisconsin, and the offices of more than a dozen subsidiary companies across the Midwest. The promised computer system failure never had a chance to happen. FBI technicians were on site to prevent any destruction of digital evidence, and federal marshals were stationed at key locations to ensure that no documents or hard drives mysteriously disappeared during the chaos of the raids. Emma entered protective custody while the investigation proceeded, living in a series of safe houses under the watchful eyes of federal agents who took the threat to her life seriously. Michael found himself in a strange limbo, too visible to disappear entirely, but too important as a witness to be left completely unprotected. He continued driving for Uber, partly to maintain some semblance of normalcy, and partly because the federal agents wanted him to stick to his regular routine as much as possible. Carlos took the news about David's death, the real story behind it, not the official version about an accidental fall, better than Michael had expected. He was home from Northwestern for winter break when Michael finally told him the truth about what had happened and what was happening now. I always wondered why Uncle David seemed so worried those last few weeks. He kept asking me about my grades, about my future plans, like he was worried he wouldn't be around to see me graduate. At the time, I thought he was just being dramatic, but it makes sense now. Carlos paused, studying his father's face with the analytical mind that had earned him a full scholarship to one of the country's top engineering programs. And, Dad, I'm proud of you for doing this. Uncle David died trying to do the right thing, and now you're finishing what he started. That takes real courage. The comment meant more to Michael than any commendation or recognition he might receive from law enforcement agencies. Knowing that his son understood the importance of what he was doing, that Carlos saw it as honoring David's memory rather than unnecessarily risking their family's security, gave Michael the strength to continue through the months of depositions, interviews, and preparation that led up to the trial. The trial itself, when it finally began 14 months after that night at Pete's Diner, became a media sensation that attracted national attention to corporate fraud and the lengths to which some companies would go to silence whistleblowers. Meridian's executives faced charges ranging from tax evasion and money laundering to conspiracy to commit murder, with prosecutors arguing that the company had systematically eliminated threats to their criminal enterprise. Emma's testimony was devastating in its methodical detail and emotional impact. Over 3 days on the witness stand, she walked the jury through years of systematic fraud, explaining complex financial transactions in terms that ordinary people could understand, and demonstrating how the stolen money had affected real people, employees whose retirement funds had been raided, shareholders who had been defrauded, and taxpayers whose services had been underfunded because of hidden corporate profits. The defense team, led by some of the most expensive white-collar criminal attorneys in the country, tried multiple strategies to discredit the prosecution's case. They portrayed Emma as a disgruntled employee with delusions of importance, who had fabricated evidence to get revenge on executives who had legitimately terminated her employment. They suggested that Michael was a grieving brother looking for someone to blame for what was genuinely an accidental death, someone who had convinced himself of conspiracy theories that had no basis in reality. But the evidence was overwhelming, and the prosecution had built their case with methodical care. Phone records showed communications between Meridian executives and Marcus Webb immediately before each of the suspicious deaths. Financial documents demonstrated a clear pattern of fraud stretching back more than 6 years. Audio recordings captured company officials discussing the need to eliminate problems and protect the business model. Most damaging of all was Webb's own testimony when he finally agreed to cooperate with federal investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence. The former military contractor and corporate security chief provided detailed accounts of how Meridian had identified, tracked, and eliminated threats to their operation, including the specific planning that had gone into making David's death look accidental. When the verdicts came down after nearly a week of jury deliberation, they were unanimous and comprehensive. Guilty on all major charges for the top 6 executives, with sentences ranging from 15 to 25 years in federal prison. Webb received 12 years for his role in the conspiracy, and more than a dozen middle managers received lesser sentences for their participation in the fraud. The financial penalties were equally severe. Meridian Industries was ordered to pay more than $200 million in fines and restitution, effectively bankrupting the company and ensuring that the stolen money would be returned to pension funds, shareholders, and tax authorities. Additional civil suits filed by affected parties would eventually drive the total cost of the fraud well over $500 million.
But for Michael, the real victory came in smaller, more personal moments of vindication and closure. David's death was officially reclassified as a homicide, giving Michael the official acknowledgement he'd needed for his own healing process. Carlos finished his sophomore year at Northwestern with a 3.9 GPA and had already been accepted into a summer internship program that would help launch his career in sustainable energy engineering. Emma, now living under a new identity in Portland, Oregon, had found work as a forensic accountant specializing in corporate fraud investigations. The federal government had helped her create a completely new life. New name, new social security number, new personal history. But she had chosen to use her experience and expertise to continue fighting the kind of corruption that had nearly killed her. She called Michael occasionally, usually when she was working on a case that reminded her of Meridian, or when she needed to talk to someone who understood the cost of standing up to powerful people who preferred to operate in shadows. "I wanted to thank you again," she said during one of these calls, about 18 months after the trial had ended. "I've been thinking about that night in the diner, about what would have happened if you'd just dropped me off at my destination and driven away like any sensible person would have done. You would have found another way," Michael said, meaning it. "People like you always do." "I'm not so sure about that. I was terrified, Michael. I was ready to run as far and fast as I could and hope they'd eventually lose interest and leave me alone. If you hadn't been there, if you hadn't told me about David and helped me understand that I wasn't alone in this, I think I would have spent the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, waiting for an accident that felt increasingly inevitable. Michael, now working part-time for Uber while Carlos finished his junior year at Northwestern, found himself thinking often about the randomness of that October night and how different everything would have been if any of 100 small decisions had gone differently. A different passenger request, a different route through the city, a different response when Emma asked to stop at the diner. Any of those variations would have led to a completely different outcome. You know what I learned through all of this? He told Emma during that same conversation. Sometimes the biggest changes in our lives come from the smallest decisions we make in moments when we don't even realize we're making them. I could have said no when you asked me to stop for coffee. You could have decided not to trust me with your story. Wilson could have dismissed us as just another pair of conspiracy theorists with more imagination than evidence. But we didn't. We all chose to do the right thing, even when it was scary. Especially when it was scary. The compensation from the civil suits that followed the criminal trials helped secure Carlos's future and allowed Michael to think about retiring from night driving eventually. But more importantly, it gave him something he'd lost when David died. A sense that the world, despite its enormous capacity for corruption and cruelty, still had room for justice when ordinary people found the courage to demand it. 2 years after that night at Pete's Diner, the ripple effects of their decision continued to spread in ways none of them had anticipated. The Meridian case had become a template for federal prosecution of corporate fraud, leading to investigations and charges against dozens of other companies that had operated under the assumption that whistleblowers could be intimidated or eliminated without consequence. Emma's new career as a forensic accountant had led her to discover fraud at 3 other companies, resulting in additional prosecutions and recovered funds totaling more than $50 million. Her expertise in corporate money laundering had made her one of the most sought-after consultants in the field, though her identity remained carefully protected. Michael had testified in 2 additional cases involving suspicious deaths of potential corporate whistleblowers, helping federal investigators build cases that had previously seemed impossible to prove. His experience with the Meridian investigation had given him insights into the patterns and methods used by companies to silence threats, expertise that proved invaluable in other prosecutions. But perhaps most importantly, their success had inspired other potential whistleblowers to come forward rather than suffer in silence or disappear mysteriously. The precedent that they had set, that ordinary people could successfully challenge corporations and win, had given courage to dozens of other individuals who might otherwise have stayed quiet and allowed fraud to continue.
Michael was picking up a passenger from O'Hare Airport on a cold February evening, 2.5 years after that life-changing night at Pete's Diner, when he got a call from an unknown number. He'd learned to be more careful about answering calls from strangers, one of many small changes that had become permanent parts of his life, but something about the timing made him pick up. "Is this Michael Rodriguez?" The voice was young, female, and carried the same nervous tremor he remembered from Emma's voice that first night. "Yes, who's this?" "My name is Lisa Park. I worked for Continental Logistics here in Denver. I found your name in some news articles about the Meridian Industries case." She paused, taking a shaky breath before continuing in a rush. "I think my company's doing something very similar to what Meridian was doing. I have evidence, documented proof of systematic fraud, but I don't know who to trust, and I'm scared to go to the police alone." Michael pulled over to the side of the road, his passenger forgotten for the moment as he recognized the familiar pattern. "Where are you right now, Lisa?" "I am at Union Station downtown. I was going to get on a train to anywhere, just run away and hope they don't find me. But then I remembered reading about you and Emma Chen, about how you helped her when she had nowhere else to turn and everyone else was either bought off or too scared to get involved." The desperation in her voice was achingly familiar, bringing back memories of Emma's first night in his car, the fear and isolation that came with carrying dangerous knowledge alone. "Lisa, listen to me very carefully. Do not get on that train. Do not go anywhere until you hear back from me. I'm going to give you the number for Agent Sarah Martinez at the FBI. She's the one who handled the Meridian case, and she's been building a task force specifically for this kind of corporate fraud. Tell her I referred you, and tell her you have another case that fits the pattern." "But what if they don't believe me? What if they think I'm just some paranoid employee who can't handle being fired?" "They'll believe you," Michael said with conviction born from experience. Agent Martinez has been waiting for cases like yours, and she has a whole team of people who know how to protect witnesses and build prosecutable cases. But you have to be brave enough to ask for help. And what if the company tries to have me killed like they tried to kill Emma? Then you'll have the entire federal government protecting you, instead of facing them alone. Lisa, I know this is terrifying. I know it feels like you're risking everything with no guarantee of success. But I also know that if you run now, you'll spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder, and the people responsible for the fraud will continue stealing money and potentially killing anyone who threatens them. After he'd connected Lisa with Agent Martinez and canceled his airport pickup to help her get safely to the Denver FBI field office, Michael sat in his car for a long time, thinking about patterns and coincidences, and the strange way that doing the right thing seemed to create opportunities for doing more right things. Carlos, now a senior at Northwestern with job offers from 3 major renewable energy companies, had developed his own theory about this phenomenon. "It's like you always taught me, Dad," he told his girlfriend when she asked about his family's involvement in corporate fraud prosecutions. "Sometimes ordinary people have to do extraordinary things, not because they're heroes or because they want recognition, but because they're the only ones in position to help when help is desperately needed." Michael wasn't entirely comfortable with being considered extraordinary, but he'd come to understand something important about the nature of courage and moral responsibility. It wasn't the absence of fear that made people act when action was needed. It was the decision to move forward despite the fear, to choose the uncertain path of doing right over the familiar path of staying safe. Emma was terrified that night at Pete's Diner, but she chose to trust him with her story instead of running away. He'd been scared of the consequences for himself and Carlos, but he'd chosen to help anyway. Wilson knew the professional risks of taking on a powerful corporation, but he pursued justice regardless of the potential cost to his career. And now Lisa Part was making the same choice, finding the courage to speak up even when it would have been safer and easier to disappear and hope for the best. The Meridian executives were serving their sentences in federal prison, their appeals exhausted and their reputations permanently destroyed. Emma was building a meaningful new life dedicated to exposing corporate corruption and protecting other whistleblowers. David's death had finally been officially acknowledged as the murder it always been, giving Michael and his family the closure they'd needed for so long. But perhaps most importantly, the precedent they'd set together was rippling outward in ways none of them had anticipated when they first sat down in that corner booth at Pete's Diner. Other whistleblowers were coming forward with evidence of fraud and corruption. Federal agencies were taking corporate threats against employees more seriously. Companies were discovering that their crimes would no longer be ignored or covered up by intimidation and violence. As Michael started his car and prepared to find another passenger, he thought about the young woman he'd just helped connect with law enforcement, about the investigation that would soon begin, about the lives that might be saved and the justice that might be served because one more person had found the courage to speak up even when it would have been safer and easier to disappear and hope for the best. He thought about the passenger who was probably wondering where their Uber driver had disappeared to, about the canceled bride fee he'd have to worry about the small inconveniences that came with choosing to get involved in other people's problems. But he also thought about the alternative, a world where people like Emma and Lisa faced corporate retaliation alone, where companies like Meridian operated with complete impunity, where ordinary people had no recourse against the extraordinary power of wealth and institutional corruption. Sometimes, as Michael had learned on a cold October night more than 2 years ago, a simple ride across the city could change everything. Not just for the people in the car, but for everyone whose lives would eventually be touched by the courage they found along the way. The ripples were still spreading, still creating opportunities for justice and accountability in places where injustice had previously gone unchallenged. Michael Rodriguez, former auto parts store employee turned part-time Uber driver, turned reluctant expert witness in corporate fraud cases, was content to be one small part of something much larger than himself. The endless, essential work of standing up for what's right, one passenger at a time, one case at a time, one act of courage at a time. As he pulled back into traffic and opened the Uber app to accept another ride request, Michael smiled and drove towards whatever story was waiting for him next. In a world where ordinary people could still make an extraordinary difference, every passenger was a possibility, every ride was an opportunity, and every night held the potential for someone to choose courage over safety and change everything for the better. The night was still young, and there were always more people who needed help getting home safely.
Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss these. Just click to watch and don't forget to subscribe.